thank you, Emily. And, as Emily said, it's great to see people from so many different places. It's wonderful, isn't it? You're all, in the middle of all the troubled times at the moment, you're all doing the same thing. You're all teachers together. And I'm very glad that you can join us this afternoon and that we can go through this session together. As Emily said, today is sort of the second part of sessions we were looking at on assessing writing. And this afternoon is self-standing. You don't need to go back and look at the other session. But if you did miss the other session, I'll point out to you where you might find more information of things we're going to cover today, because of course, we've only got an hour together, so we can't cover everything. So I'll just link you in, where you might want to go back quickly and have a look at that. So let's make a start on today. And obviously you will see from your the session you've joined, that we're very much looking at writing today. Now, we're going to start with just a little bit of considering what are the challenges in assessing writing for young learners. Now, again, we looked at this in much more detail in the autumn session, or the fall sessions, you would say. But we're just going to recap on some of these today, because they're points that affect what kind of things and how we can assess, when we're looking at the actual criteria, which is what we're focusing on today. So when we've thought about that, we'll move on to look at how we develop and standardize the assessment criteria for writing. And this is mainly, of course, when you're assessing in the classroom, because quite often the big tests, as it were, the big summative tests are imposed on you, but you may be able to look at how you can adapt some of that work. And then we're going to look at what are different ways we can use our assessment criteria, because we don't necessarily need to use them just in one way. So let's explore some different ways. Now, one thing I would say, as I said, obviously, we've only got an hour together, so we can't cover everything. So I'm going to do this by showing you some examples, but you will have to think about your own situation and how you adapt and apply things for your own situation. So I don't want you to think that the examples are gospel, or think, oh, that won't work with my students, because I'm just presenting them as opportunities here. And, you're all experienced teachers. You can have a look at how you can adapt things for your own purpose. And I'll also touch on, because many of us in this situation today, how you might manage each of these situations with online teaching. We'll have a little bit of a look at that, but that's not the focus, but we'll just consider that a little bit. So let's get started looking at, the sort of foundation of this, which is what are the challenges in assessing writing for young learners. Now, in the previous session, we looked at a great deal of these, and you will all be aware of the cognitive differences in your young learners, especially the younger they are, the more mixed that's likely to be in your class. But there are some general things that we can think about very, very specifically related to writing, and which pose a problem for trying to assess their writing in English. So these are factors caused by their age, and this is probably true even to the sort of upper age group of young learners as well. So one aspect of literacy is we've got to decide how much does orthographics matter? So in other words, how much does it matter if they can't make beautiful or correct letters in English. And obviously this is much more of a challenge if you don't have a Roman alphabet as your alphabet, but it can be a challenge anyway because of confusion with their first language. So we might have different expectations in the first language and in a second or other additional language like English, and that might change the focus of our assessment. So we might want to decide about this based on what's happening in their first language. Another aspect of literacy is how well do they write in L1? I mean, some children take a long time because it's a very slow process learning to write in their first language. And so, to be fair, we can't expect them to do more in English than they're doing in their own language. So we have to take that into consideration. And it means when we do activities in the course book that might be beyond what they're doing in their first language, we might have to adapt them or simply change what we're going to assess or judge there. So not just how well do they write in L1, but we need to think about what do they write in L1, and this can be a real issue nowadays. We have to remember our young learners probably never see adults writing. You as their teacher are probably one of the only people they see actually writing by hand. They might see their mum or dad make a list of something, but we're asking them to do all this writing, all this varied writing, and they never actually see the older people in their life doing this. And this can cause a real sort of issue with their motivation and how realistic they think things are. So we need to consider that. And then finally, something we explored a bit more in the first session, the autumn session, was the cognitive challenges and thinking about what's going on in our head when we write. And it's actually really complicated, isn't it? We have to know our reason for writing, why we're writing, what message are we trying to get across. We have to remember what kind of words or sentences might go in that writing. Then we have to plan it, then we draft it, then we might check it. And so all these elements, this is very challenging for young learners, and we can't expect them to do it all. Or let's say we have to recognize where they've achieved one or some of those things, rather than expecting it all to happen at once, which there's a bit of a tendency to do. So just before we begin, just so I get a sense of what your concerns are, and hopefully we can address those as we go through, very quickly in the chat box, remembering that you're talking to everyone, I'd like you to just make a note about your view on this. What do you think your young learners find most difficult? So you don't have to write long sentences, just put a little note in the chat box. What do you think your young learners find most difficult about writing? Okay, for writing. So you see we've got one issue there with ideas, spelling. Creative, expressing themselves, yes. Oh, there's a huge variety there. A lot of spelling, neat writing, but is that important? A lot of you, quite a few of you have put ideas and how they come up, and this connects with what's the purpose of them writing. So word order is to do with syntax, isn't it? And organizing their ideas is to do with their approach to discourse. Most of you are putting grammar, vocabulary, and punctuation. But okay, so that's interesting. So I'm going to stop you there on the chat, because we've got lots of ideas there, and that's interesting. But I hope during the course of this session, I can perhaps persuade you to look at writing, assessing writing from a slightly different angle, maybe, and see how we do with that. Because what we want to think about, which criteria do we want to assess? Now, as I said in the last session, the beginning of this, we want to, young learners don't see people writing. They don't have much motivation for writing. It feels like an exercise. It feels like something they struggle with and they're judged on. And so when we look at which criteria we want to assess, we want to somehow tackle that, not by judging them more on what they find difficult, but by judging them less on what they find difficult and more on the things that they can do. Because what we're trying to do with the young learners is get their heads into a space where they want to write and where they want to achieve something in writing and they feel confident in their writing. So even if they're getting things wrong, it's important that they're rewarded for the bits they do well so that they move on, and then gradually as they get older, they'll start to get, if you like, the technical side of writing correct. So I've divided this, recognizing your concerns, I've divided this. I'd like you maybe to think about this. You might not agree with this, but this is just an approach I'd like you to consider. That we have the core skills we're assessing in writing, and we have what I call the support skills. So now the reason we do this is because for young learners, I think we want to take a very broad range of assessment, almost a big, lots of variety in what we're assessing, but then be very specific about what we're picking and choosing to do. So we want a big toolkit to choose from, because our learners are so varied, they're going at different paces, they're facing different challenges, and also we're looking to reward them. We want it to be positive, which is something we discussed again much more in the first session, but here we're just looking at how we're judging it. So this is why I would say, as well as the core skills, which many of you have mentioned in the chat box, we also need to consider what support skills we can assess. And I say at this point, obviously, we don't do all of these at once. These are just our options to choose from. So, of course, our core examples, this isn't all of them, but examples of our core skills, the key ones might be vocabulary, grammar, and discourse, which you've all mentioned in the chat box. But in support skills, we might want to assess their attitude to writing, their enthusiasm, the way they respond to a challenge. So maybe their writing isn't very good, but we can reward their attitude and so encourage them. Something else is a support skill is following instructions and completing the task. Now, this is very important as a life skill when you go out to your job, but it's also going to be important for them in exams. So we've got it as a support skill, but it is very important. And it's something they might be able to do even if the end result isn't very accurate, for example, in vocabulary and grammar. So it's something we can reward if they've got a sense of that. And something else that is a support skill is we might want to look at how quickly they're working. We might want them to be slower. The number of attempts they do, are they willing to correct and improve their work? So these are just examples. It's not the total toolkit. These are examples of the types of things we can assess. So let's look at how we can develop these and how we can standardize them and work with them together. So I'm going to go through each of these. So we'll start with vocabulary skills, which is something that you mentioned. Now, for every single skill, whether it's a support skill or whether it's a core skill or whether it's a support skill, I would argue that you can work with your young learners to answer 3 questions before they do the task, so that everybody knows what's going on, and this will help motivate them. So one of the questions that we have to answer if we're assessing is, when we're assessing the writing, what is expected and why in vocabulary? Now, I would argue you don't want to keep this to numbers. It's not about the numbers of words, but it might be the type of words they've chosen, or the kind of punctuation around the words, or the relationship between the words and the task. So you can, obviously, you might have to do it in your first language, but it's a good idea to gently, from the beginning, get the students involved in helping decide what's expected, so that they have some investment in it. And then another question, and this is to do with their autonomous learning, is, what's the evidence of that? What is that going to look like? So if they've got good vocabulary, is that going to mean they're going to have lots of ideas? Does it mean they're going to have a good range? So rather than focusing on accuracy, because remember, we're looking at vocabulary in writing and communication here, what might the evidence be? And then finally, decide with them, how are we going to reward our assessment? And I would argue you don't use numbers, you don't use scores like 8 out of 10. You can use scales like very good, good, okay, trying. I mean, you will have your own scales that you can use, and that you might then decide how to reward them with stickers or smiles or whatever, but something holistic and preferably not to do with numbers. So if we look at a tiny little example here, now this is from the lowest level of look. So obviously they're babies, they're not going to be doing much writing here, but you can see that last activity, ask them, what do you like doing during the school vacation? Draw 3 pictures and write sentences. And so rather than worrying too much about the accuracy of their writing, we could focus on their communication. So where they've drawn the pictures, have they used the right vocabulary for the pictures they've drawn, is something that you can assess. And in the sentences, have they put the vocabulary in the right place? But keep focused on their vocabulary as it's related to communication. You might want to focus on spelling, but if you do, don't do everything else. So just have one criterion here that you're going to focus on and agree with them, so that they can concentrate rather than thinking, oh, that I've got to do 5 different things, I've got to worry about this, and then their motivation goes, because it's just too much. They get overwhelmed. So small and focused is the key. Similarly, if we look at grammar, we can go through and work out the same questions with the students. So now this would be, I think, from level 2 of look. And here they've got to write, if you like, directives or instructions to somebody. And obviously you will have done the grammar already, but you want to get them to agree here. What's expected when you're writing in grammar and why? And of course, the focus here, again, on communication, remembering this is not a grammar exercise. This is writing and communication. And so the focus is on, have you put down an instruction? And is that instruction communicative? So they might put, for example, don't forget gloves, which I think is fine. They've communicated the meaning. If they put something like, I don't forget gloves, then they haven't got the meaning, because that's not an instruction. They've got the one person in there. I'm not saying that's absolute, that's just an example, but you can, as I say, talk to the students about what you expect here and what the evidence is. And again, it might be spelling, rather than having super correct, accurate items, because that's something you want to do in your grammar check exercise, not necessarily in your writing. So I think what I'm asking you to do in writing is to pull back a bit and look at the bigger picture around the communication, because if you go in on the tiny things, they are going to get demotivated, and that's not what we want with our little ones. And again, we reward it on a scale with smileys or goods, or whatever you usually use with your class or you think that they like. Then obviously, we're still sticking with the core skills here. As you move up your class, you move up your levels, they start getting a sense of discourse, which again, some of you mentioned, and how ideas connect together. So again, you can there's a little activity here where they have to fill in from the video, but then they have to do some writing using these linking words, because we're talking about the order that things happen in. So again, you might go through with your class and say, right, what are we expecting here? When we think about how we organize our writing, what are we expecting? And of course, some of it's not just about the linking words. Some of it is about what happened when, what do we need to know that happened first, that ordering of information. So you might decide that what you're expecting is not necessarily the link words, but the ordering of information, or it might be the connecting words. And that's what you would say in your evidence. That's the evidence that we want them to look for. Obviously, you're not going to use that expression. You'll have to use it in their own words, but this is shorthand for what we're capturing today. And again, we can reward through our scale. And of course, one of the issues here comes back to a point we mentioned originally about their cognitive development. And they might, if you ask them to do this, they're writing about Elia or Caitlin or Marlin, they might struggle with that, because what they're trying to do at the same time is remember what happened in the video about these people that they probably don't know. If you're worried about their ordering of information, start with asking them to write about their own day, because that means cognitively in their head, they've got a sense already of what happened when. So they will get the order of information right. And you can reward that, and you can say, good, that's great, you got that right. And they start to feel that confidence about applying it to another situation, like the example here. So I think it's, sorry, it looks like the video's going in and out. I know the internet's overused at the moment, so we might have a couple of issues with that. So that's looking at the core skills. And as I say, I would advise when you're assessing their writing, don't do everything at once. Try to focus on one aspect or one thing, because the children can't remember lots and focus lots. But what we might do is use our core skills with the support skills. So for example, hang on, let me just move this so you can see it a bit. So again, we would go through the same approach. We would try to negotiate, to collaborate with the students on this about what is expected. So what is expected in your attitude when you're writing? Well, you're expected to sit down and do it and be motivated and be correct. And the evidence might be, how quickly do you start writing? Or how much did you concentrate for? Were you looking around the class or talking to your friends? So these are all things, behavioral things you can use to assess attitude. and hopefully encourage them to have a good attitude, because this is something they can achieve. Now, I know we're assessing their writing, but their attitude will affect the quality of their writing. So it's something we want to encourage. It's like a background skill to the core skills. So here what they have to do is they have to write a reply, like a little posting or letter in reply for advice. So what is expected, you can look at the model that you've got there and ask them. Now, again, if you're working online with them, not synchronously, you can ask them to underlie this. You can do this on worksheets. You can ask these questions on little worksheets, or you can ask them to work in groups together if you have to work offline, and then come together and discuss it, or send them a little crib sheet about it. But it's important to do that collaboration rather than impose it. So they can look at what is expected by looking at the model and what's the evidence, okay? And the evidence might be the focus of the information, the appropriacy of the vocabulary, or whatever. But essentially, what you're looking for here is a good attitude. Do they look at the model? Do they consider the model? Do they sit down and write, quickly? Now, obviously, if they're working at home, you won't be able to tell this, but you can still discuss this with them because it is important. Maybe give them a little task. How long did it take me to write this, so that you can make a judgment about their attitude. And staying focused on, we want them to communicate in writing, as somebody's just said in the chat box. So we want to encourage a sort of positive feeling about writing, rather than it being something they constantly get wrong. Now, one of the other support skills that we looked at was a criteria you can judge is, did you follow the instructions, or did you complete the task? I'm not saying both those. Again, you can talk about them. What is expected here? It's expected in this particular example that you will write a story, that it's about something that happened, that you've got to use a headline and link in words. And what is the evidence? The evidence might be, how much core information did they include in this story? Because that's what we're looking for. Or is a story, did it have a beginning, middle, and end? Is that how we know it's a story? So this might be the evidence that you're looking for, and you agree that with them before they start, because if you have an agreement with them before they start, they're more likely to do it and to get it right. And we want them to get things right to encourage this positive motivation. And again, I would reward on a scale, not with a score. So as I say, on the good or the very good, or the smileys, as it were. So you are, what we're doing here is, they might, for example, have very poor grammar, but they might be very good at following instructions. So if you want them to try to focus on, if they've got to have a motivation for getting their grammar better, if you say, oh, but you're really good at following instructions, you did a beginning, middle, and end, you had lots of information in your story or whatever, then next time they'll be motivated to try and make it better and to try and get it right. So it's worth really, really sort of trying to focus as much on the core skills the support skills to support their motivation and progress in the core skills that you need them to do well at. And again, so something else, the last example I used for the support skills, as I say, there are more if you look at the previous session, is you might want to reward them for how fast they did it, or in fact, did they take time? Is it good that they took time? Or how many attempts did they make on this? Are they prepared to go back and rewrite and do it again properly? You can reward that, even if they don't get it perfect. So again, talk to them about what is expected. How fast do you expect? Or do you expect them to do 2 drafts or to check their work? What's the evidence are you are going to agree that you're looking for? And again, they might check each other in groups here, even offline, or if you can do your little rooms in your Zoom when you're doing sort of online. And again, the same type of reward. And something else that can help you here, I know certainly with Look, and I imagine, you know, with a lot of courses, come with a sort of learner management system where you can track the learners and the work they're doing. And you can usually, sometimes you can tell how much time they took or how many attempts they made. So they don't have to be, you don't have to be online to do this. You can check this while they're offline. And it's something simple. It may look mechanical, but it's a good way of being positive with them when they may, especially when they may be struggling with, as you've said, you know, you said at the beginning, they struggle with the core skills, in fact, and things like spelling. So those are just little examples. And what we've got here is the students talk about something and then they have to write up a report. Now, by the time they do this, this is level 6, they're probably just about to stop being young learners. They're probably just about to sort of shift out of primary into their middle school or high school. And so you can expect them to do 2 or 3 drafts of a piece of writing before they're happy with it. And you should perhaps encourage them to do that, to keep going back and checking. But in order to facilitate that, so what we've looked at there is what we can assess. And in order to facilitate that, we're going to go on to look at the assessment options. But before we do, I'd like you to do a little poll for me. Emily, if you can bring up the poll. And what I would like you to do here is, you can see, I want you, these are the 6 skills we've looked at today. As I said, that's not everything, but those are just examples. You've got the 3 core skills and the 3 support skills. So just considering, you know, what you're thinking about now, can you each mark which 2 assessment skills would you like to focus on in your classes? Because it's a good idea to have a focus. So which 2 of those for writing, remember that we're assessing writing here, which 2 assessment skills would you like to focus on in your classes? So if I can just give you a few seconds just to all, you know, those who want to just all click on that. And we'll see where we are, having looked at some options in the first part of the session. So, Emily, are we getting some votes in, as it were? Ah, here we are. Oh, nice. Nice. Okay, obviously vocabulary struck out as just the most important. Of course, it is for writing. But I'm pleased to see that some of you are considering how you might assess the support skills as well to encourage them. And as I say, you want to, when you're assessing the core skills, you want them to be easy things that they're going to get right or they're going to get a good grade in, to encourage them. So that was interesting. Obviously, we couldn't tell from that poll, maybe you picked 2 core skills, but it would be nice if most of you had picked a core skill and a support skill to focus on. That would be ideal. So let's move on now. We're going to look at how then we might actually manage this assessment. So we've got some criteria that we've looked at. And so how are we going to manage this so that it helps students progress? Somebody's put speaking there, but this is a writing. I'll just remind you, this is a writing option. And I know some of you said you didn't get a chance to vote, but obviously time is, we've only got a limited time here. So I apologize if we haven't kept that open long enough for you, but it is something, it's, you know, as long as you can think about for yourself. Okay, so we've got different assessment options, most of which I suspect you use in different ways. We can do self-assessment, peer assessment, group assessment, or teacher assessment. Now, it's very, very important that the students are part of, as I've said, and understand the assessment model. So this is a way of helping them understand that. And I'd like to look through how we can use these right from the very, very beginning with our young learners. So let's start with self-assessment. Now, some of you I know find, somebody said, how often is there time for these? No, none of this is to do all together. I said at the beginning, these are options. This is your toolkit. So, and again, in the back of the lookbook, I think there's some help for you, some advice on how you use different things across different times. So remember, none of this happens all at once. You know from your own young learners, things are not immediate. They happen slowly across time. And what we're looking is to sort of build and progress. Now, self-assessment, I know some of you are concerned about using it with young learners, but let's think about why we use it. Self-assessment is very important because it's how you judge your own work, and it's a life skill, actually. And it builds very slowly across experience and time. So you can start with your very young learners, but you wouldn't necessarily expect them to be very good at it. Again, you're taking baby steps at this, but you would hope by the time they leave primary school that they've got a better sense of this, and it can help them to become autonomous learners. In other words, by making their own judgments. So let's have a look at a possible example for how this might work. And I'm going to do this with tables for you. So here's an example of self-assessment for very low-level young learners. And again, you may want to do this assessment in their first language because it's the writing in English that's important, and then understanding the assessment. Now, first of all, I would say you want a maximum of 2 criteria. As I've said, they cannot concentrate on too much else. And when you introduce it, you might even only do 1. And I would suggest you try and mix something they are very likely to have got right with something maybe that they can improve, so that they can see how this self-assessment works. So for example, we've got the example here, did I do everything in the task? Now, hopefully you'll have pre-planned it in class and you'll have discussed it. So they may have got the grammar wrong or whatever, but did I do everything? They should have got this right. So hopefully most of them would be able to put yes there. But then, did I check my work? Some of them are likely to have not done this or to have done it too quickly. And so what we want to think is, if they put a bit, so can they now make it better? How can they make it better? So in other words, you're introducing them to the idea of a judging scale, just very, very gently. And you want them to do this individually. They can do this at home offline without discussing it. And then later on, you can build it into a classroom discussion if you want to, or you can get them all to do this. You can find out what they all put, and you can discuss it when you have an online class with them. And I think it's really, really important that you introduce self-assessment before peer assessment, because peer assessment is much more face-threatening. And it's nice if your learners have got a very good idea of what it is to judge themselves before somebody else is going to judge them. And they've got a sense that when that other person talks to them, they know what they're talking about. So it's worth spending a bit of time getting them to gently practice this self-assessment. And as I say, baby steps. So then an alternative, and again, I reiterate, you don't do these all at the same time. You do these across your week or your term. You're slowly introducing different methods. And the big thing with peer assessment, I think, is managing it. I mean, children are very used to judging each other, not always in a good way. So we want to manage this so that it's positive. But why do we do it? Why do we do peer assessment? Well, it's important because it's a learning opportunity for the person doing the judging can see how others have approached a task. And as part of this, I would suggest that you switch your peers all the time, so they're not constantly working with the same person. That's probably easier online because they probably sit next to different people. But you want to make sure you do a lot of mixing and matching, because this is one of the positive outcomes of peer assessment. And also, having to judge other people reinforces your own standards. You have to think, what are the standards? And it allows you a bit of self-reflection on the standard. Now, of course, I'm not suggesting that your 6 or 7-year-olds might have that internal thought process, but you can get them used to the process of peer assessment so that then, when they do it more fully, they've got a really good sense of it. So again, let's have a look at an example. And again, I'm saying here, oh, hang on, I can't find my thing. Let's just move the thing. I'm saying here, again, you've got young learners at a maximum of 2 criteria. And again, you want to help them with the judgment things. Remember that if you've done it as I've suggested, they've been involved in the what are the criteria judgment from the beginning, so that we want very precise questions here. This is married to the other one. Did my partner do everything in the task? Again, the chances are yes, so that's a good positive question. Could my partner have used more or different vocabulary? So this isn't too critical. This is a way of helping them improve. And again, you want to start with these criteria that they're familiar with from their self-assessment. I would allow them, and I don't know if you can probably manage this offline, if they do this, to have some discussion about it. So they're not just judging their partner, but they then have some discussion about it. And I also think you should put them on the spot here. So, for example, could my partner have used more vocabulary? They put a bit. You have to say to them, okay, what then? What is this more vocabulary they could have used? So in other words, if you want a slightly negative judgment of someone, they have to help them get better. They have to help them correct it. So if you say, could my partner have used more vocabulary? Yes. Then I have to say, what, for example, is that vocabulary? So they get used to the idea that they're not just sitting in judgment, but they actually have to collaborate and help the other person with improvement points, and they can swap with each other. This can lead into, this is possibly, I would argue as they get a little bit older, probably 8, maybe going upwards. Oh. Oh, why has my screen frozen? Oh, there we are. Sorry, had it on the wrong thing. The focus for group assessments. And again, you can do this when you're working online. Now, what is it? By a group assessment, what I mean is 3 or more. So they've done their pair assessment. So let's get them used to some group assessments. And you probably don't want more than 3 or 4 in the group. Again, they could do this in a room if you're online, or they could do this sort of offline in a forum at home. Now, why do we use this? It builds their confidence, actually, because the first thing children are likely to discuss is what they've done the same. What are their similar? Oh, we did that. Oh, I put that. And they like this, and it really builds their confidence. It's also highly collaborative because we ask them to work out the improvements or solutions together. So again, they're helping each other. So let's look at a little example again of how this might work. So you might give them, again, you would agree this with them. You would agree what the assessment criteria are. They're a little bit older here, so I've actually put 3 points in, okay? But again, they're very familiar with. Now, the first thing is to get them to use these criteria to self-assess, which by this time, if they've done it for 2 or 3 years, they should be very good at. So the first thing they can do is self-assess here. Then they come together as a group and they discuss their answers. And it might be, oh, we all did the task very well. How much range did I use in vocabulary? Maybe one person's put none, or I only did a bit. Now that's the point where the rest of the group help them with ideas of how to improve. So this is a slightly different dynamic. Rather than the pair assessment, this is where the person is asking for help. I didn't get that. I didn't do that bit as well as I wanted to. How can I improve? And the others can help them. Now, if you find, for example, they've all done badly at range in vocabulary, then that's a teaching point for you, isn't it? That's something you've got to go back and help them as a class with some remedial teaching. But the chances are some will have used a lot, some won't, and they can help each other, and they'll all be good at different things. So they can all feel positive, and they can all help. They can discuss how to do things more quickly. And again, in many ways, I don't think it matters if they're doing this, I mean, I don't know what your school sort of directives are, but I don't think it matters if they're doing this in their first language, because what you're teaching them here is about assessment and standards. You know, they've already done the English language activity, so the discussion doesn't have to be in English. And then the last thing I just want to look at is the impact of teacher assessment. And I'm sure you'll be totally aware of this, but I think we've got to look at this. So you've got those other assessments going on. And of course, you're always going to have a thread through of teacher assessment. So why does it have an impact? Let's think about the purpose of teacher assessment. Obviously, it's for you to monitor progress so that you can plan future lessons, and you should make the students aware of that so they don't feel it's a top-down thing. But very, very critically and importantly, a bit like we've seen with the other assessments, it's key to give feedback to support improvement. So the teacher assessment is quite threatening for the young students. You think about the value and the judgment it incorporates. Students will be worried about this. They might have to report to their parents. So it's really, really important that they see it as a positive outcome, that they're getting feedback which is going to help them get better next time, okay? So I would say feedback, and you will read this in a lot of the research literature now, is the essential component in teacher assessment. So you shouldn't just ever be just giving stuff back. with a mark on it or a grade. It should always be helping them. And it's better to do less assessment and more feedback than lots of assessment and no feedback, I would argue. So again, here's a little, let me just move this slightly out of the way. So again, we've got two criteria here, and one of your criteria you're going to be is using the appropriate grammar. You will have discussed that with them. And your judgment is, and we want this to be positive, so it's not you didn't do this, it's, you know, what do you need to do more of? So almost always. And then you give them a feedback point, the way that an improvement point. And again, we've got examples of this in the back of, look, if you want to look at more examples. Or if the criteria is attitude, notice the feedback is not you didn't concentrate, it's you need to concentrate more at the start of the task. And then you give them some feedback. How are you going to, you know, you've given them some advice to help them the next time you do it, and you can check that they're doing this. Now, of course, obviously it depends on your teaching situation at the moment, and you can do this orally. But as we know, children have got really short memories, and they may need help anyway with your feedback idea. They may want to go back and consider it. So really, ideally, you would either write your note in the first language, or you'd have to repeat it immediately. But it's something that you want to check that they've understood. And you probably, as I said, you might be dealing with slightly older students here as well. You want to make sure it's something in writing, but if it's younger students, just put it in their first language. And again, use criteria that you've agreed and that they're very, very familiar with. So that's just looking at, so we've looked there at what criteria, examples. Remember, I just said it's a toolkit. We've only looked at examples of criteria, and then how you can manage that assessment having decided on it. And I reiterate this point of only do a couple of things. Don't try to do everything at once. Recognize that you're building assessments are real issues, so build things over time, especially in writing. So let's just have a summary of what I would say are the takeaway points here. First of all is use supportive criteria that help progress learning. So this, even in the core skills, don't worry too much about the accuracy of the grammar if it doesn't affect the meaning. Ditto the vocabulary. Try it when it's writing, try and stay focused on that communicative approach and use supportive criteria that you can say, yes, you've done well, that help them progress, you know, in their confidence or whatever. The other point I've said continually, don't judge too much at once. Monitor it compared to your children. They can only, little ones can only absorb a tiny amount, as you know. Make sure you develop your criteria with the learner input. So even if you have to support them and prompt them a lot at first, make them feel that they're included in the judgment, that it's not unfair, it's not something coming from outside. Remember that feedback is the purpose of assessment. Use different assessment formats, across the classes or across the term. So vary what you're doing and agree any, what I call logging, any writing down, any noting of the assessment with the learners. So if you're making a note about what a learner's done that you might have to pass on to parents or head teachers or something like that, make sure that the learner's been part of that process. So there we are. We've finished those notes for the session. As I say, obviously we can't cover everything in an hour, but I hope it's given you some ideas. And if you didn't watch the first session, you might want to go back and watch that. And I think Emily's just got some help for you and some notes on the, on the book and references we've been using.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you so much, Elaine. It's a great session. Thank you, everyone here. We had close to 500 people. So thank you all for being, for all your participation. It was a really great session. Just to note, several of the examples Elaine showed today came from Look, which is a 7-level series for young learners of English. If you're interested in learning more, you can check out our website to view the catalog page to get more information on Look and download a sample, or you can always contact your National Geographic Learning representative as well too. And I do just have a few housekeeping notes before we wrap up. We have about 5 minutes, Elaine, so I'm hoping we can go through. I think there were 2 questions in the question box before I get to those. One was from someone asking, do you have a special rubric that you would use and like to share? Not sure if that would be the PowerPoint slides or recording of that people could reference.
Oh, we're done here. Okay, I'll have to go back to that. Wait a minute. Do you have any special rubric that you use and you like to share? Now, this is interesting, isn't it? Because something I don't know if many of you know or not, but when you say rubric in American English, you are talking about what I call the assessment criteria or the assessment template. When you say rubric in UK English, we're talking about the instructions for the task. So we are, as ever, a single language divided by that language. We are not talking about the same thing. I assume here by rubric, you're talking about the assessment criteria, but I think I've covered that in what we've been doing. I've given you some examples there. You've got what is the error rate in self and peer assessment. I don't think there is an error rate, because remember, it's supposed to be a judgment and a discussion. So I wouldn't say, I don't like to think of it as an error rate. They maybe not be right on target, but with their thinking, but they slowly, as I've said to you, you support them and they slowly get better at it. So I would urge you to move away from any scoring and things like that, and think about it as a more subjective and helpful assessment. Okay, so hang on, I need to go back to the thing now, don't I? Is that right?
It's okay, actually. I can just mention them right here. The only thing I wanted to note is that we will be directing everyone to a feedback survey after this. So please, if you have some time, let us know what you thought of the session. It's really useful for developing ones in the future and for feedback. So please give us your feedback there. We hope you can join us again soon. I did see a question about certificates and the slides, or excuse me, the recording. We will be sending this to you within 3 business days. We'll send the recording and a certificate for joining us. And really, that's all. We hope you can join us again soon. If you missed anything here, I see a comment about electricity issues. We do post the recording on our webinar archives. You can always check it out, as well as Elaine's previous session. But thank you to our presenter, and I hope you all have a great rest of your day.
Okay, thank you.
All right, bye everyone, take care.
Okay.